Everyone. We're so glad to have you here. Welcome to our MHQ Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board Leadership Forum. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We are going to be recording this event. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the event. So you're welcome anytime to submit your question either through the chat feature or the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll be monitoring those, and then we'll be addressing those at the end. And then we're going to end promptly at the 1 hour mark. So if there are questions that you have that we didn't get around to, we'll reach out after the event and connect with you on those. A little bit about Management HQ before we get started. We are so proud to serve a diverse and incredible client base, doing amazing things for our communities. Some of the groups that are represented on today's call include the National Association for Regulatory Administration, the National Federation of Paralegal Associations, the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling, and the Association of Continuity Professionals. We're always open to considering working with new clients whose values align with yours and with ours. If you serve on another board that could benefit from Management HQ services, please have them reach out. We appreciate your time and your support of Management HQ. And now I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And Jennifer, if you would please get us started.
Sure, it's great to be here. My name is Jennifer Matthews, and I'm an associate professor at Oakland University, teaching in the graduate counseling programs. I also have a small private practice in Michigan. I'm a licensed professional counselor and provide grief services to the bereaved. And I'm a board member, proud to be a board member with the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling.
That's great. Hello, everyone. My name is Ida Martinez Freeman. I am the Managing Director at Management HQ, which means I'm mostly behind the scenes working with executive directors to ensure that the scope of services for our clients are being met, as well as working with an amazing group of very diverse staff members that we have, as well as our memberships. I come to you with experiences in higher education, as well as serving as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. My name is Melvin Tennant. I am the president and CEO of Meet Minneapolis, whose official name is the Greater Minneapolis Convention and Visitors Association. We promote Minneapolis in the area as a destination for various forms of travel. We are a 501c6 organization, 55-person staff, founded in 1987, and have a 36-member board that I work with very closely.
Well, thank you all for being here. I am Dara Rudick. I'm the CEO of Management HQ, and I will be the moderator today and ask our panelists questions. And the first question we have is this. So we've seen a movement over the past year where folks who may have not had an understanding in the past are becoming more aware of injustices to our Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC communities. What have you observed from associations and leadership recently, and what types of actions would you hope to see moving forward? And Melvin, I'm going to start with you.
Well, good morning. Good morning, Dara. Thank you for that. Well, first thing I would say is that I have seen, at least in our own board, I mentioned that we have a 36-member board. I've encouraged them to take more of a focus on sustainability and authenticity of the DE&I efforts. It really has to be a question of the proof is in the pudding. One thing I've seen that we've encouraged and also encouraging more is asking the question of what internal infrastructure is being put in place to support those DE&I efforts. I'll give you a quick example. We have heard a lot of discussion about how in the world can we make our board more diverse? And that's a great mission, but what can you do to ensure that that happens? And one of those tactics that we've put in place is to make sure that always in our nominating committee, there's a member of our diversity committee on that nominating committee to make sure that in that process, there's always someone bringing that particular perspective to the table. So sustainability, authenticity, and infrastructure is how I would answer that question, Dara.
Say to piggyback off of that, a lot of what I've seen immediately have been the statements that come from boards, from organizations, and just this ongoing dialogue amongst board members and organizations about racial injustice, but more specifically, possibly about their own biases and blind spots, and the awareness or lack thereof, and what to do with all of that. And so in having these statements, having this continuity, as Melvin mentioned, having the statement become a living action, a living philosophy.
Yeah, that's certainly on our end. We've seen a lot of executive directors really working with their associations around fine-tuning their commitment statements, as well as the larger conversations of, should we host dialogues? What would those dialogues look like? So it's really there's a renewed commitment to really getting reconnected with some of this. As you can imagine, it's really a mixed bag. We still struggle as a society around DEI work. So you will see the statements, you would see kind of the collaboration in the process. And then I think there's also going to be some room for people to worry about, are we being too political? What does that make sense? Is there room for that within our association? What would the impact be of saying and not saying something? And I think that that's definitely kind of an area of tension. When it comes to what actions I would hope to see moving forward, is I would invite our board members to really reconnect with the mission, vision, and the code of ethics of your work. What does it call you to do? How does it align around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then use that as the blueprint to stay very focused about a call that has been made, that many of us in our profession has already embraced, about what we are called to do as human beings mobilizing this work.
And Ida, when you talk about that action piece, that's such an important part of all of the kind of the statements, and then that next step being action. So thank you for that. So this past year, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, please. I'm sorry. But clearly, at the organizational level, we see statements and declarations of support for DE&I efforts, but I would just encourage us all to look at the personal commitment. There are tools that can help us define those biases, such as Jennifer mentioned, to really understand where we are in our own personal journeys. I think when you're trying to advocate for DE&I efforts, sometimes it feels threatening to some people, but I would encourage the personal responsibility and maybe taking an assessment tool so you'll know yourself where you are. It's about self-awareness. So I just wanted to add that.
That's great. Thank you, Melvin. So this past year has presented us with critical opportunities for DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion conversations. What are some of the challenges to having these conversations at the board level? And Jennifer, if you want to start this one.
Sure. Melvin was speaking to it when he mentioned assessment, and just in preparation for this talk, there's individual assessment, there's organizational assessments that can be administered, and you're looking at the strengths that an individual has, maybe some areas of growth, and that's more of a counseling type of phrase that we use instead of barriers or obstacles. But what are the growth areas? What are these opportunities? And I think a lot of the tension that we've been talking about, when there is a statement to write, the words to use, but also everyone has a different level of cultural competency. Sometimes there's an assumption that we all are very aware, we're transparent, we're authentic, and we're aware of our blind spots, and we're aware of implicit bias, and that's not the case. There's always room for improvement, and having that accountability. And so boards have a wonderful opportunity, organizations have an opportunity to reflect on themselves as an individual, but then on, what are these opportunities for our organization? How can we lessen the blind spots and lessen implicit bias in all areas of our organization.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would add that I think one of the invitations that this period of time really gives our board members is an opportunity to ask who is ultimately responsible for DEI work. And I say that's an important question to be asked, because oftentimes even within that, there's a lot of assumptions. There's the immediate, loving, very human reaction of we all are in this process, right? And I think that there's something about that that really calls us to really show and verbalize that commitment. What it looks like in practice is where we really need to start getting at that nuance of what happens really. Does it belong only with one committee? Does it only belong to like one or two people within your board? Does it only get brought up by certain people in your board? And so those are also good temperature assessments, as Melvin was mentioning, looking at the infrastructure. That's part of your infrastructure. How is that board really engaging with the vision of DEI, and how do you get to create a board where it actually can thrive? And I would invite that question.
I want to get back to something that you all touched on, was that who is responsible piece, and that kind of the work on at the individual level. And it reminds me of a conversation, Melvin, that you and I were recently in with a consultant, where we were looking at an assessment, right? And the consultant said, the really challenging part of this is sometimes CEOs don't want to take this assessment because they're afraid that when the results get out, it will show that they are not where they want to be, right? Maybe it'll show that they're racist, whatever those results will show. And just really like and the results, she assured us are confidential, but the fact that sometimes folks aren't even taking those assessments and doing the work, maybe on taking that step and doing the work on themselves because they're afraid to find out something that I would argue, and I'm sure many of you have heard me argue, is I think we were born in a racist society, and that's what we're taught, and we have work to do, right? So to kind of miss out on that opportunity to do the work, it seems a shame, and it seems like there's something we could be reframing to really kind of create that openness and discussion that you were talking about, Jennifer, around that work.
And, if I can just add on, I really appreciate, Ida, your question about who shares the responsibility, because oftentimes it is people of color that are kind of spearheading these conversations or educating other people. And it's helpful to hear about others that are allies, that this is more of an egalitarian process, that we're recognizing that, yes, this is a racist society. We all have implicit bias. And how can we work towards dismantling that?
I'll add that if you have a CEO, a white CEO that has been in the job for 20, 30 years, by all measures, very successful, all the various measurements suggest that this person has been just hugely successful. But then when faced with having to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's almost, I can imagine it being scary for an individual, but it does take courage. And we do have a number of examples of white CEOs that have taken the step of having that first conversation, taking that first assessment, and really understanding where they are in their own personal journey. That's where it goes back to that whole personal commitment. You can sign a pledge on behalf of the organization or a board and have all these fancy statements crafted by your PR department, and that's wonderful, but it's about that personal commitment. And sometimes that encouragement for a personal commitment has to come from maybe another CEO. It wouldn't necessarily come from a person who's necessarily advocating for DE&I as a profession. It just might be a colleague. So we have to encourage those conversations, make sure people feel comfortable even just starting that journey.
One of the interesting, I thought it was interesting that we were talking about as we were preparing for this forum was we were talking about, kind of not necessarily shouldn't, but what does it look like when a white person is chairing a diversity equity initiative committee or initiative, or, you know, kind of in that like traditional leadership role? And should that happen? Shouldn't that happen? And I think, Ida, it was you who said, maybe we need to revisit our structure, right? So we're working alongside and in support with each other, but not necessarily asking people of color to lead, not necessarily assuming that other people understand the experience and have that experience to lead, but really looking at our structures overall and how those accommodate the work that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that oftentimes we go through a natural structure of the one person leading a committee. And there's been many ways in which, you know, we continue to work through like different versions of this. I do think there's a lot of value of having multiple co-facilitators in the process across difference that also help model what the work looks like in action, in terms of making sense of our work shoulder to shoulder, to make sense of it through the different lenses that we see the work, that helps those co-facilitators of that community really grow and learn as well, in a way that helps start to neutralize some of the power dynamics and the automatic hierarchical structures that, whether we realize it or not, would have an impact in how far the work would go.
Thank you. So how do you all support DEI with the boards that you are involved with? Jennifer, if you want to start.
Sure. So a lot of, I would say, my response is probably more on the micro level of in the board versus the organizational structure, and a lot of what I do is really working in the role of an advocate. So advocating for having, number one, these conversations, not letting it go unsaid, for us to talk about the difficulties in facing racial injustice, the difficulties in grappling with how to integrate DEI into our work. I would also say using some immediacy when we are talking and there is a microaggression, or there's something that's inappropriate, not letting that moment pass, but really stopping, pausing, and addressing it in the moment. I think that's another way of modeling on an individual level what's appropriate, and then that can transform into more of a systemic structure of advocating and also addressing within your organization. The other piece is, and I think Melvin, you spoke to this earlier in question one, related to having leadership that really reflects the values and the mission of the organization. So advocating that there are diverse individuals related to demographics, but also thought, that are in leadership positions. It's important to hear all voices.
Yeah, I think much of my work is really behind the scenes. It's really working with the executive directors and providing some coaching opportunities to think through of how they can best strategically and thoughtfully provide some direction and some food for thought for board leaders as they are in the process of responding, you know, through a statement or maybe communicating something out to their membership, but also thinking about those connections with those principles of the profession, as well as their position as leaders, right? What kind of association do they want to lead? What kind of leaders do they want to be? And that does give a lot of opportunity for the executive directors to help provide some questions. Just like when we were talking about CEOs needing that additional support, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about people in key positions just simply knowing. And when we don't know, yet we are expected to know, you know, all of this diversity, equity, and inclusion plans come to their to their desk, and they're supposed to provide this leadership and this pathway. And at times, if that cultural competency is not there, that can really start already impacting the ability for those processes to move forward in a positive way. Is very similar to the work that I do with the executive directors, who are an awesome group of human beings. And we're still working through the different lens and essentially a mental map setting and resetting of our natural conditions that makes it like standard behaviors or certain ways, the ways we do things, right? And how you can lovingly raise questions and provide some guidance that helps us get closer to that vision.
Wow, you nailed it, Ida. That assuming that an experienced leader necessarily has cultural competence is an assumption that we can't make. And in going on to answer the question about supporting the boards that we work with, I'm involved in a lot of boards outside of my own, and it's very common that I am perhaps one of the only persons of color in a room of 20, 30, 40, 50 people. And I feel I have an obligation to make sure that an alternative viewpoint is heard, so that perhaps at the end of the meeting, someone might say, I never thought about it that way. I'm not trying to necessarily change anybody's mind, but expand their thinking and let them know that, frankly, the world doesn't revolve around them. I had a person, a former coworker, that had a little joke that says, Copernicus called and you are not the center of the universe. So you can do it, as Ida said, very lovingly, but it is really starting with expanding the viewpoints of a board that might be very, very homogenous. I would also say that I encourage boards that I have the opportunity to work with or work on to have some sort of measurement in terms of DE&I. You can't just say this is a great thing. You've got to have some measurement so that a year from now, you won't be having the exact same conversation. You want to be able to say that you've moved the needle.
That's great. And I'm going to ask for a couple of, oh, Jennifer, I didn't mean to.
I just wanted to add on, while it's at the top of my mind, when we are talking about diversifying boards, having it to be intentional and that there's mentorship there. You know, it's kind of like in the academic setting, we want diverse students to come to our colleges, institutions, places of higher learning. They're there and then there's no support. And that's where leadership is so important, that number one, as Ida mentioned, that it's at the forefront, that this is the norm that's being set by the leadership, that this is the type of environment that we want, which is openness, one able to have these difficult conversations. And then as you're bringing in people that are diverse, that there's support for them.
So a couple of examples I'm going to ask of you around things you just said. First of all, Jennifer, you mentioned addressing microaggressions in the moment. I wonder a couple of things. First of all, if you might give us a broad understanding of what you would consider how to define microaggression. Sure. And then on the flip side of that, not the flip side, but in addition to that, maybe an example of how to address when that does happen.
Sure. I'll give you an example from, I'll say, working with students. And so first, microaggressions, these are unintentional interactions that you might have that really minimize a person's experience in the world. So it can be related to gender, race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, really any descriptor. And it's creating this distance, it's creating this otherness. And it can be unintentional. Many people might say things that they really didn't intend to be critical, or they did not intend to demean someone, but that's how it is received. And that's the reality for the person on the receiving end. And so an example could be, oh, wow, you speak so well if you're talking to a person of color. That's happened to me many times as a student, even, working in different professional settings now. And so what's the implication? If you say to someone, you speak so well, it's implied that you're surprised that they are speaking well, that they are articulate, that you really are assuming that they wouldn't be. And so when that happens in the moment, I talk to counseling students all the time about trying to address it by being clear, by being direct, but having also a tutorial stance that you're really trying to come from a place of understanding. So you're acknowledging that, wow, I'm noticing that you said that I speak well. Tell me more about that. And then having the person that made the comment respond, and then also responding yourself and saying, well, when you say this is how I feel. And so this would be more of a one-to-one interaction. But if I was on the outside looking in on this particular interaction, that type of, I might say, if I'm the one observing it, that I noticed that in this discussion, person A, you said that person B spoke really well and that they were articulate. I'm wondering what that might be like for them to hear that. And that opens up this conversation about their intentions, possibly, but what's more important is not their intentions, it's how it's received. That it is a way of othering a person, it's a way of distancing them.
I love that approach.
Answer?
Mm-hmm. And I also, because Ida and I work side by side, figuratively these days, but I love Ida's approach. She will say, I would invite us to consider. And I think that's such a kind way of, as soon as, I hear her say that, I know like I'm going to be asked to consider something. But it's such a like open and, just generous way to say like, don't keep it in check there. And, I need for you to learn this. Not that it's Ida's responsibility to teach anyone that, but I think that's just, I love those approaches and I appreciate those. I know that can be really hard as leaders when we are in any situation. We either overhear it or it happens to us, or we kind of unintentionally do something. So to have some ways to address it is helpful.
Right, and I think it's not uncommon for, especially boards, there's so much to talk about. There's so much business to cover, but if I noticed it, perhaps somebody else did too. And by not talking about it, by not pausing, really is a disservice.
I would add, in terms of those microaggressions, I was really chuckling with the comment you made, Jennifer, about you're so articulate. I've had that any number of times expressed to me. But I'd also say, as a person of color, or I've even talked to women about this, there's so many comments and things that are said during the course of a day that you just don't even have time to respond to every single one of them, because that could become a job in and of itself. But I do think it is important, as both Jennifer and Ida have said, to have a kind way to make someone aware if you see that this individual continues to do the same type of thing just for their own growth, because they literally may not have the self-awareness to know that they are offending someone. But definitely as a person of color, I just can't take the time to respond to every single thing that occurs during the course of a day, unfortunately.
That's a good point. It's exhausting. Mm-hmm.
Melvin, you mentioned metrics in DEI work, and that it's important to set metrics. Can you give some examples of what metrics might look like, and maybe what they've looked like for some organizations you've worked with?
Sure. In our profession, three things come to mind. One is board composition. What is the composition of your board to people of color, to white, male, female? We track those things on our board. We also track composition of our staff, and this goes just beyond the EEOC and all of the things that you have to do. We want, for us, in the job that we have, it's important for us to have a team that reflects the clients that we're working with. So we continue to work hard to make that composition be somewhat comparable to the customers we're trying to serve. And then also in your purchasing practices, it is important to focus on small businesses of color, or small businesses in general, particularly those BIPOC businesses that are often overlooked. And I'll just make a quick comment. Dara, you know that we at the Meet Minneapolis board had a big DEI summit yesterday. And one of the comments that was made by one of the individuals is, as our industry recovers, we're in the travel and tourism industry, as we recover, we have to make sure that everybody participates in that recovery, because it could be real easy to say that we've lowered unemployment back down to 2.9%, but if you still have people of color in double-digit unemployment, have we really succeeded? So I would say purchasing, employment, staff composition, board composition.
Thanks, Melvin. Ida, I know you have worked with a number of organizations kind of around a lot of different aspects of DEI. Do you have any suggestions around metrics or ways to measure if the work we're doing is having the impact we're intending?
Mm-hmm. I always invite organizations to, many of them have already done a lot of surveys of members. They've done, they have data on the profile of their members, as well as their boards. So I always encourage people to do go back. In many cases, they have already gotten a lot of information. We seem to always want to do the next hot survey, but in many cases we already have a lot of answers about what does the profile of the organization look like and kind of what the trends have been through several years. So I always encourage people to go back to what data do they already have gathered, and what does the data tell you about who joins your organization, who is missing, what's that profile, and what the needs of each one of the particular profile of members would be. What through the years, what has the makeup of your board has looked like? Why? How are they recruited? I think recruitment is a big part that immediately people go into. I will invite people to really consider a deep focus on retention. Bringing people in is one part of the process. If we create a revolving door that people can't stay any longer, that there's a problem with the culture of the space that we're in, of the association and of the board. So I always like to encourage people to take a look at things that are more you'll have some data and things that are more qualitative in nature, like really paying attention to the culture of your board. Are they cliques? Do only some people get to kind of push certain agendas, and why? Who gets to automatically be considered in leadership positions? How does that come to be? So I also invite people to do the digging in the data that they have, see what they're missing, and make sure that they're getting some additional information, and then take the temperature of the culture in order for your recruitment efforts to be successful, but most importantly, for you to get more retention focused.
And that kind of goes to what Jennifer was saying a while back, of getting that representation at the board table or within your organization is wonderful. But how do you retain folks? How do you support that diversity once you've got it? Yeah, thank you, Ida. So what do you all suggest boards of directors and leaders in general consider as they endeavor to undertake some of this DEI work? And Ida, we'll start with you.
And I think there's a great book that I like to encourage people to read if they have, let's see, I actually have it with me. And I'm not paid by any of this, so just to let you know, but it is called The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. And it is by Siobhan McHale, so MCHALE. And this is a great read for board members to take a look at. And it walks through a very simple yet very straightforward template of how should you take that cultural temperature. What are those mental maps? What are the things, this unspoken agreements, these etiquettes that are expected, these ways in which we've always done it this way, these ways in which we start creating a particular culture that may already by design, unfortunately, may not be as inclusive. So I think I tend to like to read anyways. So, I just started reading this book and I absolutely love it. It's mostly for corporations, but there's a lot of takeaways in terms of what people can do. And that's what I would invite people to do. Oftentimes they go towards all sorts of metrics, and I think that's important. Measurable metrics are important. And if we continue to get the same results, even with consultants and so forth, you have to ask yourself the question, does our culture have anything to do with it? And does our culture create a space in which it can thrive, or it can just have a revolving door of inability to be able to retain and prove towards results?
It makes me think about some boards may have financial requirements of board members, that it's not really a spoken rule, but that there's, pre-COVID able to travel, go to different meetings. And that precludes a lot of people. That really X's out a number of people that may have the desire, also the knowledge base to serve on the board, but also may not be able to financially afford it. And so I appreciate that, because it speaks to this ongoing culture of trying to disrupt the status quo. And I'll look into that book. Thank you.
I like what you just said, Jennifer, about how recruitment takes place. I just think of an example of an organization or an association that might be looking for a new CEO. And if it's a large association, you automatically might think, well, I want to go recruit someone who has managed a large association. But with that sort of baked in institutional racism, you'll typically find that people of underrepresented groups, women, people of color, haven't really had a chance to get through the ranks to get to the position of being with another large association. So you sort of perpetuate the same thing if you continue to look in the same places. So it's important, as we've said in many different ways, to really broaden our horizons and really focus on expanding our recruitment practices and being open. I like your word, Jennifer, disrupting.
And that recruitment piece also ties back to that support piece, right? I mean, I'll speak to an initiative we're working on right now within Management HQ. One of our intentions is to develop our team internally, right? So promote people to management, maybe who don't have management experience, but who are awesome and qualified and just need the training piece. And what we found is they don't have the experience, right? So we need to do something to support that. So Ida and I have been working on a leadership development program, right? So that we kind of look at what are the things that maybe through decades of management experience, just assume everybody knows, right? But new managers maybe don't know. So really trying to step back and look at it through that different lens that, you might not be natural to you, but in order to build some of the support structures that we really need to look at building to impact the culture. Ida, is there anything you want? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that with that, oftentimes I think we really need to rethink how we define leadership. Oftentimes by design, leadership is defined through a dominant culture lens. And it gets then used as a measuring of it. And leadership it takes all sorts of different forms and different cultural ways in which people, how they express themselves, how do they make sense of the world around them, to what they prioritize, all of those different things that people navigate through. But oftentimes, because they're not seen within this box of however we have defined leadership to look like, we're missing a lot of gems that are in the communities doing some really incredible work, simply because it might not look a certain way or may not have followed a certain path to board leadership experiences. The same thing happens in our recruitment of employees, always looking for beyond not just the resume, but looking at in which ways have systems already have set human beings in a path that they have not had certain access. Can we be that place where they can get the access and get the care and support so that they can flourish? And what we have seen has been just incredible results.
And could I jump in on that leadership piece real quickly? The pandemic has presented those opportunities, in my view. Just to give a little stage setting, our organization went completely virtual on March 16th of 2020, and we haven't come back fully to our offices yet. It's been virtual. And with our need to continue our work, we had to really rely on people to take on projects in a very independent manner, everybody working independently. And we saw many examples of what I call episodic leadership, people whose titles did not reflect director, manager, VP, or anything like that. But it was really an opportunity to nurture many people in an episodic leadership position. So I just wanted to maybe encourage us during times of crisis. That's a great time for leadership development.
Great. So I want to, two things. I want to shout out Stephanie Gandy, our executive assistant, also leader of our administrative team, for managing our webinar, making this possible. Thank you, Stephanie. She has also posted the book that Ida mentioned, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, in our chat, and we'll send that out also email to this forum. So thank you for that resource, Ida. So final question before we open it up to the audience: what's your vision for the work that we're currently seeing around DEI? What needs to happen to achieve that vision? And we'll start with you, Ida.
Yeah, I mean, I think the vision continues to get clearer and clearer. I mean, we are acknowledging the areas of challenge and areas of opportunity. And however the conversations are happening, I think we're seeing more conversations that are happening, ways in which we're thinking and even creating a space in which we can struggle together with those. I think that's an important part of the vision. How are we creating spaces in which board members can, in very thoughtful ways, can make sense of this work, and also do it in a way that keeps in mind their membership and the future of their membership. Who's coming, right? What does the makeup of that membership look like? And are you ready, to lead? Are you ready as an association to stay flexible and adaptable, knowing that there's a lot of people that are coming up the ranks that will be joining your associations? A lot has changed in people's lives and continues to change with the pandemic. So I think this provides us an immense opportunity for our associations to really get grounded on who are we and what do we do, and what is our service to community. And we'll find that, as I think of like Jennifer with our friends in ADAC, just foot soldiers who are out there doing incredible work around grieving and the amount of work that's happening. What else do they need? How are we responding to those needs? What's the complexity of those needs? There's just I think the vision for me, it's an invitation for people to continue to grapple with this. And as they put metrics together, keep it practical. I think oftentimes we go with hefty goals and aspirational pieces, which I think it's important. Keep it practical. Maybe what you want to achieve in the next 6 months is a new member orientation that's more inclusive. Maybe you want to revisit your statement and get grounded on what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of our responsibilities as a member of this association to do? How do we respond to microaggressions? What's our understanding as a board when we talk to one another, right? So I think that's, my vision is to say the time is now. There's no turning back. And however stressful or tense or whichever way that it looks like, there's also a lot of beauty and a lot of opportunity for us to flourish together.
I'd like to respond next. Ida, I think you're a counselor at heart. I mean, you're amazing. I like what Melvin said about the episodic leadership. I really like that. I'll have to steal that, Melvin, that this is the time. I would say my vision going forward would be to have our mission and our visions and our organizations to really be a living and workable document, something that we're going back to, we're changing, we're editing, but it's livable. It's something that in our organization, every individual is living this out, that it really becomes a way of being, a philosophy of the organization. And in doing that, it will trickle down into all areas. We will have more diverse partnerships, vendors that are diverse, will have accountability, will be able to have these courageous conversations. But I would say the way of being of our organization needs to shift, and we're disrupting the cycle of the status quo.
You like that word disruption, don't you?
I do.
You said something so important. We at Meet Minneapolis recently revised our mission, vision, and values. And I know with a lot of organizations that go through that, once you do it, you want to sit back and admire it perhaps, and it looks like it's going to sit on a shelf and boy, we're going to really look at that. Isn't that a wonderful thing that we've just done? But what you just said, Jennifer, is that it needs to be a living, breathing document. It needs to be reviewed. It needs to be analyzed as to whether or not those who are supposed to be living under it, adhering to it, can actually do it. I've had an opportunity to participate in its creation. So I really like that, and that gives me a whole new perspective. But I would just further say that with regard to a vision and what needs to happen to achieve that vision, I would go back to that point of accountability. I still feel very strongly about accountability, personal as well as organizational. I would also say we should, in achieving that vision, limit pigeonholing and I mean by that, as we add diverse people to boards, to staffs, to speakers at conferences that organizations may plan. Those people of color or those underrepresented groups have broad experience and interests. And just because me as a Black man, I don't have to go there and tell you the Black man story. I could tell you things about marketing or sales or other things. So don't pigeonhole. That would be one thing I would suggest. I would also say that you have to commit to having these difficult conversations. And what both Ida and Jennifer have said so far is that they can be done in a very respectful, in a kind manner. I don't know that I can necessarily do that, but I think that would be the way that it should be done. Also, no shortcuts. And then finally, what I would say is that after all this work is done, after we've made the business case, after we've spoken to people with kindness and with compassion, trying to get them on board, we have to realize that not everybody is going to be on board. I would just leave you with that, unfortunately.
Thank you all. We've got some great questions from the audience. The first is an example, which I love. Here we go. We had a cringe-worthy moment on a board call late last year. It was during casual conversation before the meeting began, and the person who said it didn't even realize that they'd really said something very offensive, a reference to an inner city neighborhood using a racial stereotype. I thought it best to address directly with the person after the meeting so they would see what was wrong with what they said and how they said it and why that would offend someone, etc. In the end, they learned from it and understood and apologized. but I also wanted to let others know that it wasn't appropriate nor acceptable in some way that conveyed the education that occurred, etc. It's difficult to do so without making it demeaning. What's a good way to educate someone, share it with others, and in general, make progress from the learning opportunity?
Well, I like the idea of talking to the individual after the meeting, sharing, and that's one of the ways to educate. And then offering that, you know, perhaps other people might have, they might have reacted differently, and letting them know that you would like to share your experience hearing the comment with others. So it's not necessarily focusing on the person that made the statement, but your reaction. And I think that could be an opportunity for conversation as a larger group.
Yeah, I think addressing it one-on-one, I think this is an opportunity to leverage relationships, right? I mean, being able to, many of the volunteers know each other, have known each other, been working with each other. This is a great opportunity to leverage that relationship. And I would echo what Jennifer is saying, and I think that it's a matter of how we approach the work that could be either demeaning or seen as punitive. I think that if it's engaged coming from a place of, as a leader who really cares about you, I care enough to have this honest conversation with you because I know there's more to you than this. And instead, so there's the intent might have not been there. This, what the impact could be. Let's think together about what could have been, maybe some ways in which you know, you could approach these things a little differently, that you can do your self-awareness piece, what it's needed in order for you to grow in this area. And that is, out of love and care, a requirement of what it takes to be a leader, to have this tough conversations, and that we can have that honestly with each other. And I think what you do with that afterwards really tells the story. If the person in this case was willing to, you know, to saw that, understood it, wanted to apologize and so forth, what do we do afterwards? How do we bring people in and just say, guess what? Sometimes we're not always at our best. And this is like the air we breathe, right? We know, we had the conversation. Do you get that? What else do you need so I can support you? And let's roll up our sleeves and show in action what this work looks like. So I think that that was well done. And I think it's a matter of also reframing DEI work and having these conversations as punitive when it can be, again, an invitation, especially an invitation for community.
Absolutely.
So what I really like about this question is that this board member did have that conversation. I would say kudos for that. Those can be really, really hard conversations to have. And Jennifer and Ida, I love your suggestions for how to have those conversations. And also that this individual feels it important to use this example to really impact the culture of the board by bringing it back and sharing it in a non-threatening way. So thanks for that question. Next question, what would you recommend if you find a board that's unwilling to address their deficiencies or to make changes to systemic practices?
I would say, I would like to know what role the individual asking the question has with the board. Is the person a member of the board, or, and if that is the case, I would start with a very in-depth conversation with the chair of the board and lay out some of the specific practices or strategies, such as assessments and looking at the composition of the board and, making the case for diversifying the board. So it's hard to answer the question without knowing who this individual is. Are you a current board member, a future board member, maybe a staff person? But it really has to be a one-on-one conversation. Again, non-threatening, not embarrassing anyone, but it has to be a frank conversation. You have to get started at that personal level.
And let's assume, if this impacts anyone else's answer, that it's a board member. Thank you, Melvin.
I would have to ask why. Why the resistance? Is there fear? Is there a sense of feeling like you're going to, as an association or as a board, that you will lose, certain parts of the culture that have become so ingrained in us? Is it about power and control? Is it like, what are the why? What's happening? Does it feel like somehow DEI work's going to take away from your core mission or where you're going? Does it feel like you have to give up too much as an association in order to do the work? What is it? Like, I would want to ask, why? What is moving us this way? Why is the resistance? And dig a little bit more. That, to me, that might help people. You might find that, some of it is just really, again, that cultural competence piece and not knowing, and so forth. And I think we also have to claim that there is, in some cases, I think there's power and control. People feel like they're in a critical position. They want to keep it that way. And in many cases, it gets disguised as, we're protecting the integrity of the profession and the association. And I think we need to be careful with that and that approach. But that's also really pointing to the culture of it. How long is this the first board that feels like they're resisting, or we come from a long line of resistance, right? Like, what is that? And I think those are good questions to ask.
I agree. Looking at what are the fears, what's the underlying concern, and trying to reframe those as opportunities. So I completely agree.
Thank you all. One final question. We've got 4 minutes to go, so if you could keep your answers to about a minute, that would be wonderful. We've made strides with our board relative to DEI, but still struggle with the recruitment and retention of employees of color. Our team has almost zero success even recruiting people of color to interview. Therefore, our progress in creating a more diverse workforce continues to be an issue. Question: do we create mandates rather than targets in the process? What methods might be best? We have a small staff under 40 and our retention is great, few positions open, and when they do, it's disappointing when we make no strides in hiring the best and brightest who are also diverse.
I'll give you two quick things. One is with the COVID environment and with so many people working remote, would you consider hiring a person that doesn't necessarily live in that area working remote? That expands your potential pool of candidates. And we're certainly considering that within our organization. And secondly, we've created a staff bonus whereby if a staff person refers a person of color who is ultimately hired for a position, that person receives some financial reward for helping us recruit diverse candidates.
I am the person who's mostly in charge of the recruiting of our diverse staff members. And I think the question that I have is, where are you posting? Are you going to the traditional track and maybe needing to think about places where you might not consider as to where you're posting? Also being very intentional. I'm very intentional if I see through LinkedIn that I have people that are applying for a job posting, and I reach out to folks. I look at their resumes first and look at what they're interested in. And I do have a 30-minute visit with them to talk to them about the industry, how we do our work, what our expectations around DEI work, what's their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And even if they don't move forward, I've left an impression with them that starts creating a buzz within communities that says that this could be a place for us to consider. So would also lastly invite you to consider your recruitment plan. You might need to shift how you're approaching it from the get-go. That might need a different lens.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank you all for your participation today in the Management HQ DEI Forum. I want to thank our panelists and keep an eye out for upcoming forum announcements. Watch your inbox for a link to the recording of this forum and a free question survey. Please take the survey. We're also going to include a link to the name and author of the book Ida mentioned. And we at Management HQ are honored to serve you and work together to help all of our associations and communities thrive. Thank you all very much.